Welcome back to Midwestern Marx. Today we are talking about Che Guevara's Socialism and Man in Cuba. I'm Calla Winchell.
And I'm Carlos Garrido.
This piece is written in a letter format, which is quite interesting, and was released in 1965. That's sort of the basic context. But yeah, it's a really fascinating piece. It's probably the one that people read first when they go to Guevara to read anything, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's because he touches on quite a few themes that are basically common misunderstandings of what socialism is. And he starts off the letter by addressing a common misunderstanding. But it's also one of the places where he provides somewhat of a critique of the way that socialism is being treated in the Eastern slash Soviet style of socialism. So we want to talk about some of the points that he makes in his critique of capitalism and his critique of capitalist culture and how that's trying to be changed in the new revolutionary process, but also some of the critiques that he provides against the Soviet Union and some of the sort of critiques that socialists have provided of his work here. Some people have called it idealist. So we'd like to examine the general importance and relevance of the text. So Calla, one of the things that he starts by talking about is that socialism, many people talk about it as the abolition of the individual and the prioritization of the collective over the individual. What do you think his response is going to be to that?
I mean, I think that's like one of the, if you are talking to someone who doesn't know anything about socialism, that's what they go to, right? Like that there's some sort of collectivization that like eats people up and you lose yourself. And Guevara wants to push back on that right away because he knows that's like one of the first things that people go to. And he wants to complicate that. Essentially what he says is that the individualism in the West is fundamentally alienating, right? Like that there's no real community aspect. And so it's an individualism almost of brutality, right? Where people are living under these invisible laws of capital, unaware and isolated, right? And so he wants to propose an individualism which is connected to community and towards, a shared vision that they're working towards. I think that's really interesting. He makes it very clear that he doesn't want everyone to be the same. It's not about, being homogenous or anything like that, but that there's some kind of still collectivity that's obviously necessary, right? So it's dialectical between those things. Yeah, I find it a fascinating idea. I find it a really sort of helpful response when you hear things like that. So I've used it before, at least in arguments.
Yeah, it's one of the things that we try to do as Marxists is not just like when we're presented with the question, answer it. Part of thinking critically is also like thinking about the question itself. And what we find in this question of either individual or collective is already certain assumptions that emerge out of bourgeois society specifically,
Exactly.
which is that there is an antagonism between the individual and society. And that's kind of how he's treating the problem. He says that, no, it's not either the one or the other.
Exactly.
It's both, right? It's a situation in which the individual in socialism can be much richer, much more wealthy in terms of personal value because he identifies his own interests with the interests of the collective. And this is something that what I have found when I've taught this text with my students is that they're like, oh wow, yeah, if you think about personal interest. I just recently did a short video. I tried to do an edit and do like a 1 minute video.
It's hard to do.
It's extremely hard. He should have like one of those little, when we get socialism and that Hollywood sort of pathway and you put the stars. He should have one just for the sort of role that he's had on TikTok and making 1 minute videos on socialism. But anyways, I tried to do one about egoism and about how if you actually think about your self-interest, and you want to act in a way that's in line with what puts your self-interest furthest ahead, the most rational thing would be to realize that your self-interest is tied to the collective, right? And that's usually an argument that's used against socialism, which is that people are egoistic, et cetera, and that really doesn't make sense because we live under conditions where the vast majority of people are exploited, oppressed, and alienated. So I find that when I teach this, it's almost like common sense that it clicks, that you can get further ahead as an individual when you realize that your interest is combined with the interest of the collective.
Yeah, exactly. I think one thing that also strikes me about this point and kind of about the piece in general that I think I really appreciate about Guevara's writing is that it's a very clear example of the sort of basic Marxist idea of a superstructure and sort of being a base for all other things. And I think oftentimes when we talk about that as examples, it's much more concrete things like the world of politics and that sort of thing. I think this is a great example of what bourgeois culture, for example, can create psychologically almost as a community and those sorts of things, that it's not just sort of the more concrete material aspects of life that are, you know, built on the superstructure of economics. It's also these kinds of more ephemeral, almost like affects and feelings, like alienation that they build. And he even talks about that sort of, that there was a history to the formation of capital. And similarly, he wants to invoke that kind of history or evolving of the philosophy of communism. He makes that sort of very explicit. But I've always admired that. I think it's a really good example of that idea that you don't see very often, and it's one of my favorite reasons of the piece.
Yeah, it's he historicizes socialism, which is something that, I mean, Marx already did in his critique of the Gotha program. Jesus. He talks about like a lower and higher stage of communism, right? The higher one is the one when each produces according to their capacity and they receive according to their need, right? That's the old Christian slogan. But he says we realize it wasn't that easy.
Right.
The first stage itself wasn't the first stage. There was a few assumptions behind it. And Marx wasn't setting that out as a sort of blueprint or anything, right? But
he's
what
very
Che is
careful
realizing
never
is that,
to do that, right?
yeah, precisely, right? Because that goes against the whole spirit of the concrete analysis that has to be done in order for
Exactly.
Marxism to really try to understand the world. But one of the central things that Che notes is, how is it that we deal with the difficulties that come about after the socialist revolution? And he primarily points at two, which are difficulties that, because socialist revolutions have taken place in primarily what would be considered like backwards places where
underdeveloped, maybe.
Yeah, where
whatever.
the productive capacities haven't been that developed. They face two central difficulties, which is underdeveloped productive forces and bourgeois culture, and sometimes even feudal culture. And it's like, how do you deal with that? And one of the, I think, the most interesting parts of this piece is his critique of how the USSR and Eastern socialism dealt with it. Because he felt like in dealing with the question of how do we increase the productive forces and providing an answer that centers around material incentives, you produce more, you get more, you're unable to build the consciousness that's necessary for socialism. He used to have a saying that it doesn't pop up in this letter, but he said it elsewhere, which is that voluntary works are schools of socialist consciousness. And that sort of spirit of voluntary work, although it was present at the beginning of the development of the USSR, when it really realizes that it has to develop its productive forces, and you have all these internal contradictions and these pressures from abroad. I mean, within a year or two, the USSR gets invaded by like 7 countries. So it's not very difficult. You know, it's like imagine trying to solve algebraic equations while like boxing or something. That's how
Yeah, taking
socialism
missile
starts.
fire or something. Yeah.
Yeah, so he's not like criticizing it in the way that like liberal or anarchist Twitch streamers like criticize it today, you
Right.
know.
But he's
But
not an ideologue. And that's something I also like about Guevara, is that he's not going to just, if he's identifying a problem, he will talk about it, right? Even if it's
yeah,
maybe not popular. And so I guess I've always admired that. And he is still quite cautious, in no way is he undermining the general project of the USSR or any of those
yeah,
things. But I mean, I think one of the central ideas to this essay too is the perniciousness of the commodity form, right? Like he
yeah,
talks about that a lot. Obviously, it's the first chapter of Capital, and it's really the unit, the commodity that everything is built on in Capital, at least volume 1. And it's clear that Guevara also identifies that. And so that the problem of commodity, and then as an extension, material goods, as an incentive sort of persists, right? It's like that persistence of the old ideology, even just in mentality. I think that's a good point. I think interestingly too, throughout this piece, he always invokes duty, and you're right to
yeah,
point to it's important for him that it's voluntary work, and that you're motivated by morality. Um, and I think that's interesting. I mean, I think that's where some of the idealism accusations can come in. But that's also personally how I think, and how I try to live. And so I don't think it's very strange or very impossible. It's just about an emergent consciousness that is not always there, if that makes sense, or not there yet.
yeah, yeah. That's probably the text is divided nicely into like these little one-page sections.
Mhm.
So when it comes to like teaching it, it makes it really easy because you just
Perfect.
divide those up. But that section, the new status of work, is so
Mhm.
incredibly important. It's like we need to be able to relate to work in a fundamentally new way. It's got to be something we do voluntarily. We do it out of a sense of social duty,
Mhm.
and we find it fulfilling and freeing when it is
Right.
that we do it. And um, I hate bringing up examples from my life as an academic because obviously there's richer examples, and I'll bring a non-academic example. But the way that I would relate to that is like with reading. If you find yourself it's happened to me where I have to read something, and when I have to read it for a class, I can't enjoy it the same
I
as
know
if I
this
were
feeling
reading it
so
in the summer,
well. Yeah.
right? There's
And
something
it
about
can be
someone
great.
forcing it.
Yeah.
Yeah, you could love the reading. It could be your
Yeah.
field, it could be what you love, but there's something about someone telling you to read it that makes it less enjoyable. That
Mhm.
makes it like the readings that I do on my own, I remember the
Mhm.
things better. I find it more interesting than the stuff that I go through like in a course.
Yeah.
So I there is that element to it. Sometimes we think that it's just the work people
Mhm.
do that's wrong. We just have to think about work differently. But it's really the context in which
Mhm.
that work exists. I
Yes.
remember in being very very young, and my mom was always complaining about my grandfather, her dad,
Mhm.
um, because in Cuba he was always like coming home late because he would stay working
Mhm.
overtime, and she was always pissed off, and my grandma was always pissed off about it. Um, and I know there's going to be some degenerates in the comments that are going to be like, he wasn't working, he was doing something else. But no, he was he was working, and I sat down with him once, and I asked him like, why would you work so hard? This was before I I became a communist, but why would you work so hard if you weren't getting anything out of it?
Yeah.
And his response was that every time I worked, I realized that if I laid a pipe here, I was helping people in the town next to mine. And
Yes.
it was that spirit of when I do something, I help the community. And when I help the community, I help myself, right?
Right.
And that, it almost blew my mind. And that's that new status of work that Che was trying to
Mhm.
cultivate, and which he was trying to critique in his trips to Eastern Europe and say they're not really developing that, right?
Right. It's
Uh,
still that same orientation towards work as almost, yeah, still perpetuating labor as commodity, and that same kind of alienation that comes from not seeing the fruit of your labor manifest in any, real way, but just being shipped across the country to someone or whatever. And I think it's a really important point. Is that it's not just, I don't know, it's not just about purely economic or those sorts of things. It's philosophical implications, and changing the way we think about work. I think it's kind of, I at least had a question. There's also a really interesting section where he talks about art, makes another critique of the USSR, even milder this time, I think. But he talks about art and a necessity to create a new form of art, that's obviously, not referencing bourgeois periods of the past. And it made me think about, what is the relationship between art and labor? And at what point does art become labor and labor become art? And I think that he's at least trying to get at that, which I've always found interesting. I mean, I think part of it is just bias. I love art. I love the artistic world. I think communists should all think more about art as a revolutionary tool, among other things. But yeah, I find that sort of component here in this piece really interesting and telling.
We also have to remember, I don't know when it is that like the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 44 get translated into Spanish. We were just talking before we started recording about him reading French. Maybe he read them in French, but
Probably.
I know in English they get translated in the 60s by Eric Fromm. He publishes a book called Marx's Concept of Man. I don't know when it is in Spanish, but in this text, which is clearly very influential in Che's later life, he's talking about alienation, and he's bringing up this more spiritual component that was more directly visible in the young Marx. I think it's still there in the old Marx, but it's more directly visible. And the way that Marx talks about work, there's always an aesthetic element to it. Like work is always connected to something that is not just a creative social expression that mediates the metabolism of humans and nature,
right.
But there's also always an aesthetic element to it, which is not always there with the other animals that sort of do labor.
Right. There's the famous passage of the spider building the web, sort of in comparison.
The spider and the bees, and so it's I think that's definitely influential in this text. And I mean, he talks about art in capitalism as something that we do to escape, right?
Yes,
we find
as almost like a catharsis. He calls it a pressure valve, which I love. So he's not very Aristotelian in his thinking about art. Aristotle would be very mad there's no catharsis at the end, but I think he'd be fine with that.
We for most of our day, we're reduced to the level of a thing because our labor power
makes us commodity.
Makes us into a commodity, which is no different than anything else. The only difference is that we're the only commodity that can produce value and create value.
Lucky us.
But after that, it's like, what do we do? And he's like, well, what you find in capitalist society is that people turn to art because it's the only place where they can creatively express themselves.
They escape.
They escape. So he's not too clear either. This is a letter, this isn't like a philosophical treatise that he's
not fully developed it. It's not gone through drafts.
Yeah, but that's a good question of how is it that we should think about the relationship of labor to art. And
it also has me thinking, I've recently been, I go back and forth between these two modes of wanting to know everything the CIA has ever done and wanting to completely ignore them. And usually the one about wanting to know everything they've done wins out. It's an unhealthy habit. So one thing I've been looking into recently is the funding of cultural projects by the CIA in the 60s. And especially, I think it's relevant here, their funding of, abstract expressionism and, a few of those movements. And their reasons were basically to demonstrate that capitalism was still capable of creating new things, I guess, and still like fertile ground for creation. But I've always found that so strange. And so clearly they saw the importance that Che has identified as well, that there's a real battle to be won. I mean, also the CIA had a giant budget and they could do whatever they want with it. So if they paid artists, that's fine too. But I think it's about more than that, right? Like that there's an ideological component that both sides recognize its importance. And also a lot of the artists didn't always know they were taking money from the CIA. So you don't have to hate Georgia O'Keeffe. I'll let you off the hook for that.
What's interesting is that he says at some point that part of the failure of socialist art has been that the artists haven't been revolutionary enough.
Yeah.
And it seems almost paradoxical because he's criticizing the art for adopting the style of bourgeois realism and creating with it socialist realism. And he's going to say that that's not enough. It's not enough to turn to the past, but that there needs to be a new form of art that has to be created in the socialist epoch.
And it's interesting. I mean, I've always liked, I mean, I like realism. I like the 19th century realism too. So I like obviously then the socialist references, but aesthetically, but I've always found it a little flat, where the idea is very clear what it's supposed to convey, and there's not a lot of interpretation or you know, anything like that. And so in that sense, it almost renders them just visual representations of ideas, which is an interesting thing to look at art. But I think Guevara is asking more of it. And I think it's right to ask more of it. And that's my mild critique of Soviet realism, which, I mean, he even qualifies it. He says, gosh, I wish I could find the quote. It's kind of funny. But, you know, he's not that upset about it, I don't think. I just think it's an interesting point. And couples nicely with his wider disagreement with their material incentives. I won't find it. It's okay.
Yeah. Well, it's how we should do critique. It's critique from the position of like camaraderie. It's
Every
never
time.
like I'm
of knowing we can do better.
Yeah, and today I don't know if it's internet culture, I don't know if it's just bourgeois culture in general, but today it doesn't seem like many people know how to critique others' ideas
without completely devaluing and destroying them, right? And villainizing them. Yeah, no, it sucks. I mean, I've talked a lot about
it's such a weird way to approach life.
Yeah, for people that should be your comrades. It's very
I always wonder, like, how do the people that engage in that discourse, at least online, how do they build friendships in real life? if you had to agree with everyone,
how do they read too? Like, when you have such carefully held beliefs, are you not reading people that might disagree with you that are also communists? It just feels like this weird, narrow echo chamber. And I think it's unfortunate. I wish we had a broader understanding of comradeship. That as long as there's a shared collective vision of the future, which most of the time you agree on where basically we want to go, maybe you just disagree about how we get there, that's comradeship. Like, we do not have very many. We need to cling to each other. The importance of individuals connected to community is clear here. We should also talk a little bit maybe about the vanguardism and the relationship between the people and the vanguard. I don't know if that discussion fits here, but we should definitely talk about it.
Yes, it's a big topic, and when I had an interesting misunderstanding when I was teaching this last week, which was he has a passage about the relationship of the leader, Fidel, mainly to the masses, and he's explicitly saying that the people follow Fidel, but they don't do so as sheeps and
blindly.
And they don't do so blindly. And for some reason, I had like a student misunderstand it and say that you know the masses are supposed to follow the leader as sheeps do a shepherd. And I'm like, no,
he doesn't want that.
Of what he's trying to say.
Yeah.
But that's something like fundamentally new. It's like I don't want to say it's populism, but it's a dialectical relationship between the leader and the masses, right?
Well, I think one key distinction he makes between maybe this kind of movement and a movement like a social justice movement in the West is that oftentimes those will die with an individual, or people will just get ground back down into capital. And I think about the George Floyd protests, like they have died down. People have to go back to work, like you can't protest as much. It's really grim to see, but like it's a perfect example of what Guevara is talking about and describing. And I think in contrast, the mass has sustained Cuba. But generally, like it's the reason that it's still where it is. Fidel is gone, right? It's not dependent necessarily on the leader. But that they've what sustained it. I think it's what makes Cuba unique and really interesting. And the description here is fascinating because he frames it as very dialectical, right? Like yes, they follow him, but when the government has made mistakes, and Guevara is very open about, sometimes they take the wrong turn, people are less enthusiastic, and Fidel reads that and comes back, so it's not just a top-down thing. It's relational, and I don't know, Castro can read the vibes. That's how I'll put it.
It's reciprocal. There's a there was a saying that Fidel used to say, which is that it's not that it's the masses that make the leader. And we have that relationship, or that's what he's trying to get at least, where if there's any disconnection and there begins to be errors, you begin to see a disconnection.
Right, and you feel it.
The masses and the only way to solve that is constantly being self-critical. And right. I it's interesting because a lot of these points get at some of the narratives that are created against socialism. And one of them usually is that, well, you can't critique the government, right? We know what sort of spaces these narratives come from, but that's just so untrue. If you were unable to critique the government, there would be like no government in a year, because if you make a mistake, you wouldn't be able to feel the mistake. You have to, in order to constantly keep up with that reciprocal connection you have with the masses, you need to create the conditions so that there's a space of comradely based self-critique, so that you can continuously fix it. And mistakes are not a problem, but systematizing mistakes are, right.
And this is not theoretical either in Cuba. Like if a local community had solved a problem, the main government would then adopt it and apply that everywhere. Like it's not just that the education or knowledge is even just coming from the top. If parts of a community have solved something, that knowledge is applied, roundly. And so in that sense, it still maintains that dialectical sort of relationship too. And I think it's the strength, maybe that's too big to say, but I think it's the strength of this revolution that has sustained it and that has made it still such an achievement, I think, if I can say, and betray my bias.
It's so we have, I was talking to a comrade the other day when I right before I was going in to teach this. And one of the things that he was telling me was that we were talking about Che Guevara's face as being commodified, being put on T-shirts and stuff.
Yes, and it's such an interesting contradiction, isn't it?
Yeah, he told me that he used to go up to people when he saw them wearing them, and he's like, "So, do you think that socialism and man in Cuba was idealist?" Just random people on the street. But it got us talking about that point. Because it's very easy to claim that some of the things that he's saying here, the new status of work, how we have to approach work, how we have to approach art, it's very easy to say that those are just idealist things, but I don't think they are. Like, how do you have a situation where in Cuba is absolutely determined to have to trade with other countries just because of its size, lack of resources, and the American blockade. The Soviet Union falls, or it's overthrown, whatever we want to say.
Illegally dissolved, whatever we want to say.
Somehow people vote 79 in favor of keeping it, but democracy,
it's fine. Democracy. And people still want it now. That's fine.
Yeah, exactly. But their biggest trading partner just collapses. And
Mhm.
somehow they survived the 90s, the
They
special period.
persist. Yeah.
How do they do that
The
without
mass.
having developed
Yeah.
that spirit that he was talking about
Yeah.
that allows you to make sacrifices,
Mhm.
material sacrifices in the face of necessity in order to sustain sovereignty, in order to
Right.
sustain the revolution, to sustain your freedom,
Mhm.
right? Um,
And
so
that's not
is that
idealistic.
idealist?
You know what I mean? Like, I think there's idealism here a little bit, which we have to, right? Like, in order to be a communist, you have to believe a better world is possible, right? Like, period. So, like, the idealism is in all of us. Um, but I think he's also practical in a lot of ways and very realistic. He talks about that there will be wrong turns and we will have to self-correct. He even talks about some. And so I find that criticism interesting. I think it's like one of the easiest things to, if you don't want to be mean and you hear someone's a communist, you just say, oh, well, I think it's a good idea in practice, but not in theory or whatever. Yeah, no, in theory, but not in practice. I've just betrayed my own thing. But anyways, I think that that accusation of idealism is really common, really easy, and frankly, kind of lazy. We have to believe a better
Mhm.
world is possible, but that doesn't mean that, like, I don't know, all aspects. Maybe the revolution of work is idealistic, but I don't even see that as a negative. It's just something to aim for. And I think especially given sort of how the USSR ended up shaking out, a lot of his critiques about the material production and that sort of thing, and honestly a failure to, in some ways, create a fully new consciousness, I think is more interesting now than it was maybe when it was first written and we didn't know.
Mhm. And I think that sometimes it goes back to uh, it goes back to how we end up thinking about the utopian socialists
Mhm.
and what was utopian or idealist about them. And it wasn't just that they were conceiving of a world from their heads,
Mhm.
but tied to that, at the core of that, was that they did not have a concrete understanding of capitalism and how
Right.
capitalism creates the conditions for socialism. And Che does.
Mhm.
Che does
Oh,
have that
yeah.
understanding. So if
Yes.
he's postulating that we need something new, he's working from a concrete understanding, knowing very well what Hegel would call a real possibility, something that you
Mhm.
could actually actualize. Um, so I don't think it's idealist, but it also depends on how you read it, right?
Yeah.
If you're reading it from with an understanding of the context of someone who's working within a people who have already won a revolution or who are
Yeah.
in the construction of a revolution, it's not idealist. Now, if you make it a precondition for a
Yes.
revolution, if you like take what he's saying there and then apply it to like where we are right now,
Yeah.
it's like, okay, maybe there's some idealism there because you're using two different concrete contexts,
Mhm.
and you're applying the same conclusion. And the whole point of being a Marxist Leninist and of applying dialectical materialism is understanding your situation concretely
Right.
and devising from that ways to move forward in the class struggle. So conclusions cannot just be mapped out into other contexts. You have to study each context concretely. So I think that's where the idealism is at, and that's not
Right.
Che's fault. It is misinterpretation, which of course is natural. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. No,
So
I think I take that account. I think that's quite convincing. Um, yeah, I think it's interesting though, because he makes it very clear, and I think I mean, he acknowledges Lenin's, uh, I guess, idea of this, um, that, Marx had initially expected the revolutions to come from sort of the higher stages of capital and that the contradictions would heighten and come from there. And that hasn't really happened. That instead, he uses the phrase, the lowest branches off the imperial tree. Guevara does in this, or that's a paraphrasing. But that instead it's been these sort of smaller countries, and a lot of it from the global south, and thank God for them. Um, and I think that's interesting too, right? That again, it's that analysis of material conditions, right? It's not just sticking to dogma and what was foretold, but actually seeing what works. And I think that that helps to then tone down some of the, like you said, idealism. Because if anyone had said that the revolutionaries would win, on July 26th in 53, it would be nuts. Like, it would be nuts. It was as nuts as the American Revolution, as all these things. And they were able to realize it. So then with that kind of revolutionary fervor and then continuing, I mean, basically, I think in the first 2 years, they took their literacy rate up like 30% from 60 to 90, like achieving incredible things. Tell me where the idealism is. But yeah, I mean, if you tried to bring it to New York or something like that, it would probably be like disastrous because it's different material conditions.
That's one of the other things that people talk about, how they try to say that what Che was trying to do in Bolivia was absurd because the conditions weren't there and it was bound to fail. And they add this element of necessity that isn't necessarily there. I mean, if you would have analyzed the conditions in Bolivia and the conditions in Cuba, you would have thought he was as insane to think that the revolution would have worked in Cuba.
Right? Yeah, maybe even more so given how close it was to America, the ties it had to the CIA and the mafia. Like, it's pretty crazy. And they did it and have continued to do it. So, I mean, in that context, it feels hard to call anything idealistic. But I do take the criticism. It's there, at least, a little bit. But I think you're right, read in context, not so much.
I think, you mentioned something, which is that there's always an element of idealism. There's always a bit of idealism. And that's true. Some parts of the Marxist tradition fail to understand that dialectical materialism doesn't just overcome the mechanistic materialism of the French and the British in the 17th and 18th century, and of bourgeois materialism since then. It also overcomes idealism, but by overcoming both, it sustains parts of both. And what you get in certain
Hegelian synthesis.
What you get in certain, and specifically like the Marxist humanist tradition is an understanding that we have overcome both idealism and materialism. But it also relates to how it is that we think about both, right? The incorporation of Hegel into Marxism incorporates elements which Hegel would have considered idealist. Like, we have ontologically a category of the infinite, and the infinite is not something tangible. It's not something you can touch empirically. It's not something material. It is an idealist postulation. But we accept it into our way of understanding dialectical materialism, understanding how the world is. So that's another thing that in my personal research, I've been examining, which is, how is it that we think of idealism? We usually just think of idealism as idea comes before matter, blah, 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 blah. Okay, that's one aspect of it. But if we're able to reject one aspect of materialism and hold on to the other, why is it that when we reject one aspect of idealism and incorporate another, we reject idealism as a whole?
It seems to defeat it as a whole when it maybe shouldn't. I think that makes a lot of sense. Because Che is such a devoted Marxist, there's so much Hegel in him. And I know that he read a lot of Hegel too. And so it's interesting because you can see the glimpses, or maybe I just see them everywhere because I see Hegel everywhere. But it's probably both, right? And I think that that's a good point, right? That acknowledging that one aspect of any philosophy is incorrect does not necessarily defeat the whole. And that's dialectics.
Yeah, well, Hegel would say that that no philosophy is actually incompatible because they're all just part of this one great system, and there's nothing incompatible with one and the other. But anyways, I think that he does a great job here in showing how it is that you can critique from a position of camaraderie. And I think that even if we say that the concrete situation out of which he realizes some of his conclusions is not the one that we're in, and maybe the conclusions that he has come to, we're going to have to pin maybe for the future. Just the process of how he's doing critique is something that we can take away.
Well, because it's still constructive, and I think the larger ideas apply even if the specific material conditions do not. I mean, when he emphasizes the importance of education as a way to create a new person, I think that's incredibly compelling, and I think that that would be something that would more or less apply everywhere. Different forms of education, whatever you want, but that would be necessary to sustain any revolution. I mean, and every time I've looked into revolutions, generally, not necessarily all communist even, it always feels like it's a failure. They rush, you make haste, right? Like you achieve the revolution fast and you just want people to get there right away. And there's no expectation of transition. And I wonder, and I think Cuba's achieved that, when you have sort of decades to make that switch, I think that's when it becomes successful. And I think those kinds of lessons are key, right? I mean, and make sure everyone's literate so everyone can read like basic things like that.
Right, right. It's those elementary things that that really accumulate, and then out of nowhere you're like, okay, now everyone's literate, and they're not just literate, they are literate with the socialist consciousness that allows them to make a decade and a half's worth of sacrifices. And we always think about like that.
They make the reading so sinister, like, and it was only so they could read communist propaganda. And it's like, but you weren't teaching them to read at all. Like, I don't know, like what to tell you. It's just so funny, making even like good things bad. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah. But he has an interesting way of phrasing. So we mentioned at the beginning that he talks about two central problems that that socialist construction finds right at the beginning, which is underdeveloped productive forces, and the other one was the culture. The way to solve the culture one, he is very clear, is through education. You have to have the current generations create the conditions so that there's the education and the culture in place, so that the next generations don't have what he called the original sin.
Right, the remnants of the culture.
The remnants of the old bourgeois culture. So do you think, how should we approach these sort of critiques and these points in a context in which, I mean, we don't even have, at the moment, we're building it, but we don't even have like an organized working class movement. We're just so far behind, it seems. But how do we approach these critiques if they seem so like far ahead in our struggle?
Well, in the piece, he seems to suggest that it's the role of the vanguard to sort of build and educate people, but not, again, top down, but much more sort of together, right? Like the vanguard is not necessarily separate, but that's their role. So I think that would have to be, we have to build the vanguard and then slowly disseminate information and hope the people come to it. And that, because he does emphasize again and again, ultimately the education does need to be self-pursued, like the self does need to pursue it. But we see the success of programs. I mean, the Black Panthers had a ton of things that education came, it was incredibly important. Also, the reason they wear berets is for Che. I just learned that. Did you? I did not know that. But anyways, and so I think we've seen that lesson again and again. But it is tricky, obviously, because their situation is different. At this point, like they have their own ministers of education, like they can appoint someone, and we don't have control of those things. So we're at a much earlier stage. So I don't know. I mean, I think it's tricky, but I think that would be the answer that at least this text would suggest. Now, how do we do that? I mean, I've just said buzzwords. We should build a vanguard. Yeah, I'm not sure.
It's such a delicate issue because it's so easy to misunderstand what the vanguard is, and or the sort of the relationship that the vanguard is supposed to have to the masses, right? Usually some of the critiques that come from the anti-Marxist Leninist spaces of people, usually academics that still consider themselves Marxist, is that the vanguard is just like fucking taking the people and pulling them. And that's not necessarily the case. There's this midpoint. If you get too far ahead, you lose them. And if you're too far behind, you're just at the level of the masses and you're not a vanguard.
Right.
There's like this midpoint. Stalin referred to it with the words of Lenin as the vanguard has to be a sort of detachment of from the
Right.
working class.
Inner
It's not the best
between.
word.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's not the best word because it's like outside, but the way I think of it is almost like a, like if you have the mass here in just one big circle, it's like connected, you have another smaller circle. That's how I
Right.
thought about the idea of detachment. And he gets to that in this text very well, which is where does the vanguard has to position itself? And the ultimate goal for socialism is to create the conditions so that the whole mass is uh,
Is
basically a
vanguard.
vanguard. Yeah,
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 right. And in that way, I don't see how it's exclusionary, right? Like the idea
not
is
at all.
just to pull more, but in no way is it to separate. I do think your point is a good one. It is a delicate balance between pulling people to ideas they may not have considered and alienating them.
Mhm.
That's, I think, a constant balance we all do, every day. But I think ultimately, right, the goal is that the people are the vanguard. And I think in the paper here, he would then term that as the mass in a way, that they've sort of internalized that to such an extent that everyone understands sort of the basics of communism and can explain it. And that's the goal, right?
Yeah.
But it's harder, it's trickier in the American context. I sort of waver back and forth between where do you think the origin, well, maybe this is, if there were to be a successful revolution, it would have to be global ultimately, right? Or we'd have to stop the US from intervening, because that's been sort of the big problem. And so my fantasy is obviously to just have it happen here. And then we would lose the enemy of all the other projects around the world. But yeah, as I look at the material conditions here, it is less
Yeah,
less hospitable than I can imagine.
that's one of the interesting thing which appears in certain forms of what I would consider like left deviations, is the disparaging of the U.S. in terms of its global role in the revolutionary movement, and it's
Yeah.
so fundamental. There's this film. Maybe you could help me with the title. The Examined Life. It's the one
Yeah,
with
that sounds
Cornel
right.
West.
Yeah.
Okay. There's a scene of Michael Hart, the guy who wrote Empire, which is actually right there,
Right there.
with Negri,
Mhm.
Tony Negri. But there's a scene that he's in, I think, New York. He's in a canoe, and the reporter asks him about his time in Nicaragua, and he says that he had gone to Nicaragua to fight alongside the Sandinistas,
Mhm.
and he's like, "How can I help?" And they were like, "Go the fuck back home and have your revolution over there. That's the
Right.
biggest help we can get." And
Exactly.
people don't realize that often, which is that the best thing that could probably happen to the socialist struggles in the third world is if the empire collapses.
Right.
And the way that the empire is going to collapse is if the working class comes to power here, there's a socialist revolution,
Right.
and we completely eliminate the empire, right? We abolish the empire. So it usually comes from these like third world Marxist, Maoist, third world
Mhm.
Maoist perspectives. And it's not everyone, I don't like throwing people in the basket, but
No.
when I've seen it, it's been from those angles, and it promotes a similar pessimism when you say that everyone in the U.S. or in the West, the Western imperialist countries, is uh, is ultimately futile when it comes to revolutionary activity.
Mm.
It promotes the same pessimism of like the Frankfurt School. Part of what Marcuse
Yeah.
critiques in the Soviet Marxism book, Leninism, for doing is that Lenin saw that there was a labor aristocracy, but he only said it was the top strata of the working class. Where he messed up was that he should have realized that the whole working class gets absorbed
Right.
in the imperialist countries. And that same pessimism, that it's quite literally just one dimensional, man, the sort of architect of this, that pessimism that arises out of the Frankfurt School is paradoxically replicated by this
Mhm.
sort of left deviation, which says that nothing could be done in the US, it's going to have to come from the third world. Well, it's
Yeah,
not one or the other. If we
no.
want the third world to flourish and their socialist revolutions to flourish, we have to fight
Get rid of the
every day
number
of our
one
lives.
enemy.
We're here. Exactly. Right.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, I think that's exactly right. It's not one or the other. And I think the ultimate goal should be, because not every socialist project has failed because of the US, but it feels like 99%, right? Like, and that idea of imperialist entrapment is, yes, I think it is the single best thing we could do. Now, is that idealism? Of course, but it has to be done. We have to think it's possible, because otherwise I think it dooms a lot of other projects that could flourish. I mean, basically, yeah, we have to dissolve empire in order to allow Soviet projects, Soviet, slip of the tongue, socialist projects to work. Yeah, I think, at least I agree. I think so. But that was sort
And
of a question that
what
I
would it,
kept returning to here is,
yeah.
in light of this successful revolution, what would it look like if we achieved
Mhm.
that?
Yeah, and I think part of the I think we're starting to see how it might come about. There's no general formula,
No,
but
we've seen
I
that.
do think,
Yeah.
yeah, I do think there's a few elements that we can expect to be there when there's a revolution. Um, the traditional Marxist and Marxist-Leninist interpretation says that, well, you need the working class organized.
Mhm.
Okay, what we're seeing is the working class organizing itself
Yes,
very
certainly.
recently, and you need crisis. You
Which
need a crisis at which,
we have in spades. If
boy, are
late
we in
capital has
crisis.
anything, it is crisis.
Right, right. So it seems like at least the material conditions are there, and
Mhm.
if they go away for a couple years because there's like a boom, they're very quickly back,
Yeah,
and more because of the sort of mass lumpenization and just mass precarity that's being created
the
for the working
precarity.
class. Yeah, the crisis almost like never leaves
Mhm.
in big portions of the working class. So um, the material conditions are there, and what's missing? Well, that, in my opinion, that revolutionary consciousness
Yeah.
and the vanguard to disseminate that revolutionary consciousness on the masses. Um, so we can't underplay the role of idea, right?
Mhm.
Ideas move the hell out of people.
Yeah. Yeah, and respond. He talks about, in contrast to US propaganda, that Marxism could be explained pretty clearly and people would accept it because it made sense. That there's sort of this basic
Mm.
sense to it. And I think that's right, that there's people respond to things that sound true. And
Yeah.
Marxism can pretty easily be made to not sound true. It is true. Um, yeah, I think people respond to that. They don't want to be treated like they're stupid. They can understand. Anyone can understand. And it's not that hard. I mean, it's once you can talk to someone, it's not that hard. It's just about getting them not scared of the beret and Che Guevara t-shirt and all that stuff.
Yeah, and it's also a case of another misunderstanding that we have, which is that a lot of people seem to think that we're supposed to organize ideologies, that we
Mhm.
organize people based on their ideology. No, we organize people based on their class.
Yeah,
That's the most important thing,
it
right?
is
Which means
class.
that
Yeah.
they could politically be anywhere, but because of the objective conditions that they're in, because of their class, that is why they're revolutionary.
Mhm.
Which means that if we set ourselves up to to organize only people who vote Democrat,
Right.
we're losing like
Perfectly agree. Whatever.
basically half of the working class. We don't get to pick the working class we have.
No.
We have to work with the one that we do have, and
I mean, that's the lesson that Fred
find that
Hampton.
midpoint where we're not too far ahead.
Yeah, Fred Hampton taught us that. I mean, I know that's maybe a little too simplistic, but that was his, or at least to me, one of the crowning achievements, is that it is not, it's the poor against the rich. That's the only real division that we should be talking about, because we do have such a shared, like it's shitty to work at Amazon, Republican or Democrat, like it's shitty to work in these brutal conditions no matter who you voted for. And it's tricky because it's not like I personally want to hang out with some of these people, but I do not think their labor power should be exploited, or that they deserve an alienation so deep that they can't sleep at night. Like it doesn't have to be one or the other. And you're right. I mean, I think we cannot pick our working class. I wish we could, but if I had that kind of power, I'd do a lot more things. And we can't. So what we're left with is the one we have. And if we've sort of agreed that it's imperative for the success of socialist projects around the world that we get our shit under control here, we need to understand that.
And if we think about the places where revolution has taken place,
Hold, yeah.
Most specifically, I'm thinking about Latin America. They've been pretty relatively small countries, which means that in terms of tactics, they could get away with the similar tactics being applied everywhere. We're pretty darn big.
Yes.
So we have to learn how to adjust our tactics in different regions. Maybe in the coast, a certain type of approach works, and maybe in the heartland, a different type of approach works. Because I experienced it organizing with Eddie and with others during the Bernie campaign, when we would approach just milquetoast liberals that were from middle class, lawyer dad or whatever, right?
Not open.
They would not listen.
No.
They would not listen, because even though ideologically, in terms of their social beliefs, they were in agreement with us, they would not listen because their class position wouldn't allow them to listen.
Exactly.
Right?
There's that saying.
Were you gonna say this? Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to do it? Say it. the saying. Yeah. Go ahead.
Sinclair, is it Sinclair?
The Upton Sinclair quote, right? That it is difficult.
I heard it from you.
Oh, okay. It's just an Upton Sinclair quote. It is difficult to get a man to understand an idea that his salary depends on not understanding, right? It's just that. It is imperative for people of that kind of class association where they're doing better than most people, but they want to do even better. It's that aspirational jump. There's total class loyalty to people who could not give a shit about these middle class lawyers, right? Like billionaires do not give a shit about you. You will never be one. But there's that loyalty. And I think in the same, or in the inverted way, people who've experienced poverty responded to Bernie's message, and there's a response in general, because like we've said, the experiences of the material conditions of the US is the first chapter of education. Maybe not even the first, maybe the first 5 chapters is personal experience. And then it's just sort of meeting people and taking them the rest of the way, I would think.
Yeah. There's no formula, but there's elements that have to be there. And as an organizer, one of the central elements is like, you have to go where the masses are at.
That's a key lesson from this reading, right? Is that it's necessary to be able to respond that way.
And learn how to place yourself, not to be too far ahead, too far behind. And what I found when I was organizing was that if I was talking to a working class Trump supporter and then to a middle class liberal, I was sure as shit gonna get the Trump guy to sign a commit to caucus card, which is what we were using to organize. We were getting people to commit to caucus.
It was great. I mean, it did work. Well, sort of.
But they were much more likely just because of the economic side of it, because they understood the message. And I often found that I used to walk around with like the Fred Hampton and Black Panther Party pin,
Mm.
and I would often be asked like, "Oh, are you a communist?" And I would say yes, and they would ask me, "Oh, explain what that means or whatever."
Yeah, a
And
lot
I'd
of times
often
people are
find,
genuinely curious, right? Like they've been told to
yeah,
be scared for so long, and then when they meet us in the flesh and we look like normal and wear clothes and stuff, it's amazing. Sorry, go ahead.
I don't have horns growing out, but
Yeah, right.
I, I, when I would explain it, I for some reason would find that they'd be much more acceptant of a traditional Marxist program
Mm,
than even Bernie. Like some of
mm,
them, I remember I had this one conversation with a guy who came from a farming background, and he's like, that all that all sounds fine and dandy, but it just feels like handouts. And
mm.
then he asked me if I was a communist. He's like, what does that mean? And then I started explaining it, and he was like, that sounds a whole lot better. I'm like, okay, so
Yeah,
no to Bernie, yes to
yeah.
communism. But it's that's
But
something
isn't
that we
that, I
forget. We
mean,
try to organize people based on ideology, and it's like, no,
yeah.
we have to organize them based on class. And we just had the Chris Smalls, the organizer who led the first victory for unionization and an Amazon facility in New York.
Mhm.
He went on Tucker Carlson, and there's been this big thing that has blown over about whether he should have gone, because what Tucker was trying to do is just play on the contradiction that might exist between the progressive movement and the political sphere and workers organizing. But it's like it's the most watched show in cable
Right.
America. There's a whole lot of working class people watching it, right?
Mhm.
It's not everyone that's middle class watching it, right? I'm sure it's some, but of course you have to go on there and display a pro worker agenda and also talk about how it is that it can work,
That it
how it is that it can
benefits.
work. Yeah. So,
Right.
and I think he did a phenomenal job, but I find that the people criticizing him are stuck in this framework of we organize based on what people think and
Mhm.
not based on what the class position is. And that is
Right.
never going to lead to socialism.
Right. No, I mean, I think, at least to me, the lesson I learned from both Bernie campaigns was not that it was too radical, right? Like that, I think that's the establishment's takeaway, is that he was too much and that's why he didn't win. And I think it's very different. I think that he did not go far enough. Um, this is again the trouble of the vanguard. Like, how do you balance this? But I personally feel that if he had gone farther, he would have been more successful. And that people would have responded more and sort of heightened that contrast between Clinton and himself, and yeah, just make it clear. That was always my big takeaway, but then I am a radical at heart, so I was always going to be my takeaway, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. It's almost like I remember at one point we all felt like what we would construct with our hands, he would destroy with his feet. We would place them in an antagonistic position to the Democrats, and
And
then
then yeah,
just destroy that, right? How
it's an
it was so
interesting
infuriating.
impulse. Yeah, it's something in him. And yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. I've seen the same thing, and he'll sort of go over again and again and try to work with people. And I think that's part of it, is he has like this pragmatism that he just wants to work with anyone. And it is what allows Sanders, to get a lot of legislation through amendments and things like that. But also, when you need to have that stark contrast ideologically, you can't sort of say, don't we all agree on most things? And it did feel like he did that sometimes. Yeah. Oh
Well,
well.
that's the this is why people, there's this trend that's like, just don't read. You don't need to read. It's absurd. Whoever's telling that is your class enemy.
It's the
But
worst. Yeah.
uh, people need to read Lenin, because Lenin talks very clearly about how it is that we should think about building coalitions.
Mhm.
And he says, look, we need to learn how to get the sort of divisions that exist in our class enemies and play on them in a way that advances our class struggle. And if we're going to make coalitions with people in class positions that are not ours, we have to be very clear that those coalitions are not going to stop us from criticizing them in the points that
Yes.
we have to criticize them, right? And that doesn't seem to be how we're doing coalitions. It's like we limit how much we can critique the Democrats here, how much we critique
Yeah.
there. And
pull
I don't know if
punches.
that's helpful, right?
No.
We pull a lot of punches when in terms of critique, maybe we shouldn't pull that many punches. We could not, I'm not placing myself in any position here, but I'm just saying that you can go into coalitions while still critiquing.
Right. It's not an agreement with everything they've ever done, and nor does it have to be. Great. What else should we talk about? I feel like we've kind of covered it all. Are there any other big ideas or points that you want to make?
Well, the one thing that got people in my class to be like, aha,
Mhm.
was how one joins the party. Because the question is, well, how the hell do you figure out who's the vanguard? If the vanguard's supposed to be the most developed and class conscious part of the working class, how do you know who it is?
Mhm.
And Che answers that by saying, well, the people that are in the party are voted in by their fellow workers,
Mhm.
right? So, which that's not the structure that most parties have, but um, it's a structure that very, very clearly helps you see, oh, that's how you can think of a
Right.
vanguard as the actual most advanced part of the working class, because it's the working class deciding, well, who's the most advanced.
Representatives.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I found that that part, I tried to emphasize that part in class, and it helped people get a little bit more comfortable with this idea of a vanguard.
Mhm.
Um, but I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a good passage to highlight, or and sort of as a way to understand what a vanguard might look like. Um, yeah, and I guess I just turn back to lessons we can learn from it. Um, and yeah, I think that obviously it would be ideal if we could get that kind of engagement where the working class would choose its own vanguard, right? And I don't really know how we build that. Um, except through educating and making people read, right? You're right. Anyone who tells you to read is fundamentally, or not read, is fundamentally your enemy, right? Like these texts are not hard. I mean, this one is 20 pages or something like that printed out.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
quick. You don't have to read all of Capital, not right away. You should eventually, but not right away. There's other things that are much, very accessible. And I think this is a good example of that. But yeah, I mean, that's the ultimate question. How do we translate
yeah,
into movement building, which is ultimately what a vanguard is the soul of.
yeah. And it's gonna take sacrifice. It's gonna take duty. That's
And
something
he
that he
emphasizes that
emphasizes.
a lot in this transitional phase, especially. It's a lot of sacrifice. And again, that's that pragmatism that also runs through. And he's very practical about certain things.
Mm. Yeah. I found. I don't know if you saw it, but there was an interview that I'm forgetting her name, but Brianna Joy. You know what I'm talking
Mhm.
about?
Yeah, yeah. You mean the didn't she also organize for Sanders? Is that the woman I'm
Yeah, she
thinking
was
of?
with Bernie. I think she was writing for Counter Affairs.
Mm.
Um, but anyways, I'm forgetting the name of her show, but she just had Christopher Hedges on, and they were talking about revolution. How do you have a revolution? And interviewing him, she was like kind of getting desperate, because it he the way that Chris was phrasing it, it made it seem like how it is, which is that it's a whole lot of work. You know, you could
Yeah.
organize your whole life and not um, have only gotten one step further, and maybe laid some seeds for further generations. And I think that's part of what Che is trying to get at there with sacrifice, that
Mm.
if you dedicate yourself to the life of a revolutionary, you have to know that you're sacrificing a lot of things. Sometimes you're sacrificing family life, life with friends,
Mm.
partying. You're sacrificing various things um, for something that can both come next week, or it can only get you a step further in your whole lifetime.
Right.
But it's worth doing. It's a life worth living.
Yeah.
Um,
No, I think that's right. And I think part of the idea of revolution, there's this interesting piece, it's in an anthology I read a year or two ago called The Promise and Perils of Populism. And the piece is called Insurgency Doesn't Have a Plan, It Is the Plan. And he talks about how part of protest and revolution is about actualizing the world you want to live in before it comes into being, if that makes sense. And I certainly saw that in the protests throughout in June of 2020, where I saw mutual aid and community care and clear anti-racism and anti-fascism implemented in the streets, right? Like we weren't just talking about it or protesting, but you actually saw it, right? Tons of mutual aid. And that's a way to actualize that it's not just about achieving something later, but about bringing it into being. And I think that's key for all revolutions, is that it's about bringing that world forward, even if it takes 10 years, basically. Because it took, what, how many years were they imprisoned? Started in 53, and then they won in, was it 57? 59. So, I mean, you know, obviously Guevara sacrificed his life. And so there's huge sacrifices of that. But if you embody that in your revolution, it's a way of bringing forward that world. And I think ultimately that's what Guevara is aiming for, is that his own sort of recognition of duty and those things, he's trying to bring that consciousness that he envisions into the future, sort of conjuring now. And I think that's a really good way to look at it. We need glimpses of that better world to come, I think. By the way, the guy that wrote that piece, the Insurgencies Don't Have a Plan, They Are the Plan, is Benjamin Arditi, if people want to go read it. I think it's available online. It's a little liberal, right? Like I don't agree with all the things, but I think it's an interesting idea that I keep coming back to, and I see in this Guevara piece as well.
Yeah, right. There's this balance between like virtue signaling that's again perhaps harmful to building a mass revolutionary movement, but there's also this other side of discipline, which at its core means incorporating some of the things that you want to see in the society you're working towards. It's the lead example. So it's both a rejection of Bernstein, the movement, or the path is everything. I'm forgetting the direct quote, but his formulation of reformism is like the path is everything or something like that. It's a midpoint between that and the end is everything. It's like, you know, you have to think about both of them dialectically, especially if you're in the vanguard or thinking about how a vanguard should function.
Right.
It's a both and, like start incorporating some of the things you want to see in the next society.
Without looking like you're applying for sainthood or something like that. Yeah, because you have to show that you'll walk the walk, right? Like I think one of the things that kills us the most is hypocrisy, which it doesn't kill liberal or conservative the politicians, but hypocrisy gets us, right? Like you're such an idealist and yet you own a car or whatever. And so yeah, we have to be careful of that, like that we can't just talk about it, we also have to live it, but not as caricatures. And that's a balance that each of us has to work out.
The last point that I wanted to make was that he makes in the piece, and that I find it helpful, is how it is that revolutionary leaders should live. We talked about the element of sacrifice. We talked about the role of duty, but just the material way in which they live, they're supposed to live like the average workers.
Exactly.
Right?
And Guevara did that. He was so sort of aesthetic and self-denying.
There's so many good stories of him like going into a workplace and they give him, he not only does the same work, but they bring him the food. And there's one story where the food that they brought him was better than the stuff that everyone else was eating. And he like threw the dish, he's like, give me what they're eating. So it's that's very important, because that's part of, again, this being able to be connected
to the people. There's an authenticity. You earn the respect.
Whereas in the US, what do I think the average congressperson, they're making like $200,000, and that's just salary.
Right.
A lot of them get inside.
Yeah, I mean, we look at insider trading. Just follow Nancy Pelosi's investing if you want to do it, because you'll make a killing. It's ugly. It's ugly.
So it's just at that level how anyone could actually represent their constituents when they're making 300, 400 times more than them.
Well, they do represent their constituents. Their constituents just aren't the people that vote for them. They're representing class interest really well. But you're right. As far as an embodiment of true representation of a people, it is very abysmal.
Well, I like that point, because it was one of those like easy things to realize. By you know, when you teach, you're not teaching people who think like you. You're teaching people who maybe have thought about these things, never got into these conclusions, but maybe they just haven't thought about it at all. And I find that this is one of those points that everyone, it doesn't matter if the student is Republican, apolitical, liberal, it doesn't matter what they are, everyone agrees that you can't really represent people when you're living a millionaire lifestyle. Like, it's very hard. There's a disconnection there, and that it's more valuable.
And it shows.
If you state it, and that's not new. Che's not developing that for the first time. Marx wrote about it in his writings on the Civil War in France, which was on the Commune. Lenin obviously restates it in State and Revolution, but have the leaders live like regular working people. That's fundamental, right?
Yeah, it is, and you get such goodwill out of it, and you earn it, right? It's that relationship, that dialectic between the people and the representative. Great. Well, I think we've probably done reasonable justice to this piece. I would encourage everyone to read it. It's available on the Marxist Archive. You could order it from your local library or bookstore if you want to scandalize them. It's kind of fun to do sometimes. But yeah, I really recommend reading it.
Well, have it attached to the description, of the video, and I think we already have it on our online library, so you'd be able to check it out.
Look there too. Yeah. So it's available. Give it a read. I think his ideas remain very pertinent and very interesting. And I think especially his response to that problem of the individual, which is such a sort of easy snipe at socialists, is incredibly helpful. If you take that away, that's great.
Yeah, it's he draws good on the paradox of a society that claims itself to value individualism, but which simultaneously reduces 90-something% of the population to commodities
and just homogenous labor, right? It's one of those contradictions that Marx talked so much about.
Absolutely. So thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you made it this far along, thank you.
Thank you.